Tonight, you are listening to true crime for sleep. There is no music in the background, no sudden sounds, and no rush to the storytelling. Just a calm, night documentary tone, told slowly, respectfully, and gently enough to help you rest. So wherever you are right now, allow yourself to settle. Dim the lights if you can. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest comfortably. If your day has been heavy, you do not need to carry it into the night with you. This episode is designed to be soothing and steady. You do not have to stay focused on every detail. You can drift in and out. You can listen for a while, then let your mind soften, then come back again. Sleep does not need perfect silence. Sometimes it arrives more easily when your mind has something calm to follow. Tonight's case takes us far from the streets of London and into the wide-open distance of Australia. It is a story that has stayed in the national memory for decades, not only because of the crimes themselves, but because of the setting. Long highways, thick bushland, quiet stretches of road that feel endless. The kind of landscape that can feel free and beautiful, and at the same time, remote and unknowable. This is the story often referred to as the Backpacker Murders, a series of killings that took place in the early 1990s in New South Wales. It became one of the most significant criminal investigations in Australian history, involving missing travellers, growing public fear, and years of police work before the full truth became clear. Because this channel is made for sleep, we will approach this story carefully. We will not use graphic descriptions. We will not sensationalize the harm done. We will speak about confirmed facts, and where claims are disputed, we will separate them clearly so you always know what is established and what is uncertain. This case is also a reminder of how travel can hold two realities at once. The first reality is joy, the feeling of movement, of possibility, of starting over in a new place with nothing but a bag and a plan. The second reality is vulnerability, because when you travel, you often trust strangers, you rely on chance, and you step into places where no one knows your name. In the early 1990s, backpacking was a symbol of freedom. It was a way for young people to see the world with limited money and unlimited curiosity. Australia, with its coastlines and cities and long stretches of road, was a dream destination. It promised adventure, sunshine, and the kind of stories people would tell for the rest of their lives. But in this story, that dream slowly became something darker. Not all at once, and not in a way that anyone could easily see coming. It began with disappearances, with families waiting for phone calls, with plans that stopped making sense, with the quiet dread that settles in when someone who should have checked in does not. And then, over time, it became something police could no longer treat as separate incidents. It became a pattern, a series, a case that asked a frightening question. What happens when danger hides inside the open road? Tonight, we will move slowly through the landscape and the timeline. We will talk about the victims as people first, not as names in a list. We will follow the investigation as it unfolded, step by step, and we will reach the confirmed legal outcomes that brought this case into the history of Australian crime. But for now, you do not need to think ahead. All you have to do is rest. Take a slow breath in and let it out gently. Feel the quiet in your room. Feel the stillness around you. Let the story begin at its own pace as the night continues to deepen. And when you are ready, we will start in Australia in the 1990s, in a country of long distances and open skies, where freedom and risk were sometimes separated by only a single decision on the side of a road. In the early 1990s, Australia held a powerful image in the minds of travellers. It was bright, open, and spacious, the kind of place that felt like it had more sky than anywhere else. People imagined long coastlines, warm cities, and roads that stretched so far into the distance that they seemed to disappear into the light. For young travellers, especially backpackers, Australia was not just a destination, it was a chapter of life. A place where routines could be replaced with movement, where days were shaped by new faces and new landscapes, where the future did not need to be planned too tightly. Backpacking in that era had its own culture. It was built on hostiles, word of mouth, travel guides, and handwritten notes passed between strangers. People compared routes, swapped stories, and shared tips about the safest ways to get from one place to another. There was a certain trust in that community, a belief that travelers looked out for each other. It was also a time when travel felt less tracked. Mobile phones were not common in the way they are today. There were no constant location updates, no instant messages to confirm you had arrived safely. When you moved through the world, you moved with a kind of quiet independence, and the people who cared about you back home often relied on occasional calls, postcards, or planned check-ins that could be delayed without causing immediate alarm. Australia's roads were part of what made the experience so unforgettable. The country is vast, and distance is not an abstract concept there. It is real, physical space. Hours of driving without passing a major town. Long highways with thin lines of trees and open land on either side. Roads where the radio fades, where the night arrives suddenly, and where you can feel, in a very deep way, how far you are from everything. For many travelers, that distance felt like freedom. It meant possibility. It meant escape. It meant the thrill of being somewhere big enough to hold any kind of story. But distance can also create vulnerability. Because when something goes wrong, far from a crowded place, help does not arrive quickly. When someone disappears in a remote area, there are fewer witnesses, fewer cameras, fewer traces. In the early 1990s, hitchhiking was still seen by some as a normal part of travel. Not for everyone, and not without warnings, but it was a practice that existed within backpacker culture. Some people used it because it was cheap. Some used it because it was social. Some used it because in a large country with long distances, it felt like a simple way to keep moving. Hitchhiking also carried a certain myth. The idea that strangers were mostly kind, that rides were mostly safe, that the world, even in unfamiliar places, could be navigated through trust. And often, that trust was rewarded. Most of the time, the stranger offering a ride was just a person passing through. Someone who saw a traveler on the roadside and decided to help. Thousands of journeys happened safely and quietly, leaving behind nothing but memories and photographs. But true crime often lives in the small percentage of moments when trust is met by harm. That is what makes these stories so unsettling. Not because they suggest the world is always dangerous, but because they show that danger can hide inside ordinary choices. It can appear without warning. It can wear a normal face. It can drive a normal car. It can feel like nothing at all until it is too late. In Australia, there were also areas that felt deeply isolated. The bushland, the national parks, and the wide spaces between cities. These places were beautiful. They were part of what made the country feel unique. But they were also places where a person could vanish without being seen, and where a crime could remain hidden for a long time. This combination of freedom and distance shaped the environment in which the backpacker murders occurred. The victims were travelers. Many were young, many were far from home, many were trusting the road, trusting the journey, trusting the sense that adventure would end in a safe memory. And in the beginning, there was nothing obvious to suggest otherwise. The missing persons reports that would come later did not arrive in a single wave. They arrived slowly as individual stories. A person who did not call, a person who did not reach the next stop, a plan that stopped making sense. This is how patterns can form without being recognized immediately. A case like this does not begin as a series in the police mind. It begins as separate concerns, separate families, separate names, separate dates. It takes time, and it takes careful investigation for those separate points to begin forming a line. In the early stages, even the idea of a serial offender can feel too extreme to accept. People want to believe there is a simple explanation: a missed bus, a change of plans, a traveler who decided to move on without telling anyone, a misunderstanding, a delay, a coincidence. But as time passes, coincidence becomes harder to believe. And in this story, the feeling of freedom that drew people to Australia became the same thing that created risk. The vast roads that promised adventure also offered a way for harm to move quietly. The open spaces that felt beautiful also created places where evidence could disappear into silence. This is the atmosphere of Australia in the 1990s, as many backpackers experienced it. A country that felt welcoming, bright, and alive with possibility. A place where friendships were made quickly and journeys began with excitement. And in the background, unseen at first, there was a danger moving through that same landscape, waiting for the right moments, hidden in the ordinary rhythm of travel. A reminder that the road can be both a promise and a question, a path forward and a place where someone can disappear. Before this story became known as an investigation, before it became headlines in courtrooms and national memory, it began as individual lives moving through the world with hope. People who were not thinking about danger, but about the future. People who were not trying to become part of history, but simply trying to live. That is the most important place to begin when we speak about victims. Not as names on a timeline, and not as details inside a crime story, but as human beings with plans, personalities, and ordinary dreams. The cases connected to what became known as the backpacker murders involved several victims, many of them young travelers. Some came from Australia, some came from overseas. Many were exploring the country in the way backpackers often do, moving between cities, staying in hostels, sharing stories with strangers who quickly became friends. Two of the most widely known victims were Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, both from Melbourne. They were young, adventurous, and by all accounts, close friends who shared the kind of bond that forms between people who are planning a life and enjoying it at the same time. Caroline and Joanne were traveling together in 1992. Like many travelers, they were moving through New South Wales, a region filled with both busy coastal areas and deep stretches of bushland. Their trip was not unusual. It was the kind of journey that many people make, trusting the road, trusting their instincts, and believing they will return with stories to tell. But Caroline and Joanne did not return. In the early stages, their disappearance was like many others. It was uncertainty. It was phone calls unanswered. It was families and friends waiting longer than they should have had to wait. It was the slow shift from mild concern into fear. Another victim connected to this case was Debbie Freeman, an Australian woman who disappeared in 1989. Debbie's disappearance occurred before the others, that would later become more widely linked in the public mind, and at the time, it did not immediately form a pattern that could be easily seen. Disappearance cases often begin without clarity, and in many situations, the first assumption is that the missing person may have changed plans, that something delayed them, that communication was interrupted. Police investigations must consider these possibilities, because most missing person reports do not end in the worst outcome. But in this series, the worst outcome did come, and over time, the separate disappearances began to feel connected by more than coincidence. Two other names that became central to this story were Simone Schmidl and Anja Habschied, young German travelers who went missing in 1991. Their disappearance added an international dimension to the case. The painful reality that this was not only affecting Australian families, but families far away, waiting for news across oceans. Simone and Anja were traveling through Australia, experiencing the country as so many backpackers did, exploring, moving from place to place, meeting people, relying on the informal networks of travel culture. They were young, far from home, and like many travelers, they likely believed that the journey would be something they carried warmly for the rest of their lives. When someone goes missing far from home, it creates a particular kind of helplessness. Families cannot search the streets themselves. They cannot visit police stations easily. They cannot look into the landscape that swallowed the silence. They are left waiting for information from a distance, hoping that someone will see, someone will remember, someone will find a clue that brings their loved one back. The victims in this story were not connected by one obvious choice or one shared mistake. They were connected by a journey, by movement, by the openness of travel, where people step into spaces they do not fully know, trusting that most encounters will be harmless. This is one of the most difficult truths in cases like this. The victims were doing something ordinary for their stage of life. They were exploring, they were traveling, they were moving forward, and the harm that came to them was not because of a flaw in them. It was because of someone else's decisions. When we talk about victims respectfully, we also avoid turning them into warnings. It is tempting, after tragedies, to say this is why you should never do certain things. Never trust strangers, never hitchhike, never travel alone, never take risks. But reality is more complex than that. Millions of people travel safely. Millions of people meet strangers who become friends. The world cannot be lived only through fear. The real lesson is not that the victims should have lived differently. The real lesson is that danger can exist in places that look normal, and that sometimes the worst people in society take advantage of the openness that makes life feel free. The victims in this case had families, friends, and futures. They had the kind of youth that is filled with possibility, the kind of time where the world still feels wide, where your life can still become many different things. When those lives were taken, it created a loss that went beyond individual grief. It changed the way people thought about travel. It changed the way people thought about hitchhiking. It changed the way police and communities responded to patterns of missing backpackers. And it changed the way Australia remembered that era of road travel. The victims also remind us of something quiet. When people travel, they often become a little invisible to the places they pass through. They sleep in hostels where names change every day. They move through towns where no one knows them. They may not have strong ties in the communities they visit. That invisibility is part of the freedom of travel, but it can also become a weakness when something goes wrong. Because when a traveler disappears, there are fewer people nearby who can say, "This is not normal. This is not someone simply changing plans. This is someone who should be here." And in the early 1990s, before constant mobile communication and tracking, it could take longer for that alarm to sound. Longer for families to realize something was truly wrong. Longer for police to see a missing traveler as something urgent rather than simply a person who moved on. In this story, time mattered. Patterns took time to form. Connections took time to be recognized. And families carried worry for long stretches before answers arrived. Tonight, as we move through this case, it is worth holding these victims in mind as people first. Not as part of a frightening story, but as young lives on a journey. Lives that began with excitement, lives that should have returned home, and lives that deserve to be remembered with care, even as the case itself becomes larger and darker in the chapters that follow. The earliest stage of a case like this rarely looks like a pattern. It begins in a quieter way, with separate stories that do not yet connect to one another. A person does not arrive where expected. A call does not come. A friend waits longer than planned. A family feels that first uneasy shift from calm to concern. In Australia, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, these concerns began to appear as missing person reports. They came from different places, different families, and different points in time. At first, each disappearance was its own story. Each one seemed like it might still have an ordinary explanation. Travel is full of delays. People change plans. Backpackers move spontaneously. A long drive turns into an overnight stay somewhere new. A bus is missed. A phone call is forgotten. In an era before constant contact, it was possible to lose track of someone for longer than we would accept today. But the disappearances linked to this case were not ordinary delays. They were absences that did not resolve. One of the earlier disappearances connected to the backpacker murders involved Debbie Frame, an Australian woman who disappeared in December 1989. Debbie had been travelling, and when she did not return as expected, concern began to grow. At the time, her disappearance did not immediately form part of a wider known pattern. It stood alone, uncertain and unresolved, like so many missing person cases do in the beginning. Then, in early 1991, two young German travelers, Simone Schmidl and Anja Habschild, went missing while traveling through Australia. Their disappearance drew attention not only because two people vanished together, but because they were far from home. They were young, traveling the country, and their families were left waiting for updates from across the world. For the families of Simone and Anja, the uncertainty would have been painful in a specific way. There is worry, and then there is distance. The distance makes everything feel slower. It makes every piece of news harder to confirm. It places your loved one in a landscape you cannot picture clearly, filled with roads and forests and towns you have never visited. In many missing person investigations, police begin by establishing the last confirmed sighting. They ask where the person was staying. They gather information about travel plans. They look at bank activity. They ask other travelers if they remember seeing them. They try to find the last reliable moment before the silence began. But with backpackers, those last reliable moments can be difficult to pin down. People meet briefly and then separate. Names are not always remembered. Plans change often. A person can be seen in a hostel one day and gone the next, and no one may think twice about it. As the year went on, another disappearance would become one of the most discussed in this case. In April 1992, Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, two young women from Melbourne, were travelling together. They were close friends, and they were on a journey that was meant to be part of the freedom and excitement of young adulthood. Caroline and Joanne disappeared while travelling in New South Wales. When they did not return, their families and friends began searching for answers. At first, there may have been small hope that something simple had happened. A delay, a change of route, a decision to stay longer somewhere beautiful. But as time passed with no contact, hope began to mix with fear. What makes cases like this especially painful is the way they unfold in stages. It is not always immediate panic. It is the slow realization that something is wrong. And the slowness does not make it easier. It makes it more haunting. Investigators faced the reality that these missing persons were not connected in an obvious way, at least not at first. Different years, different travelers, different circumstances. But over time, some similarities began to appear. The ages, the travel style, the routes through New South Wales, the vulnerability of being far from home, relying on the openness of the road. In many major investigations, the most important question becomes whether separate incidents are related. If they are related, then the investigation must change. It becomes larger, it becomes more urgent, and the public begins to understand that a single disappearance is no longer just one family's fear. It may be part of something bigger. In the early 1990s, Australia's police forces were working in an environment where information sharing between departments and regions was not always as quick or streamlined as it is today. Cases could be handled locally at first. Missing person reports might be managed in separate systems, and the idea that multiple disappearances were linked might not become obvious until enough time passed for someone to step back and see the pattern. This is one reason why serial crime is sometimes recognized later rather than sooner. Not because investigators do not care, but because the early information is scattered. It takes time for pieces to reach each other. In the months and years of these disappearances, families continued to wait. They searched, they called, they asked questions. They lived with the strange feeling of uncertainty, the kind that makes everyday life feel unreal. A missing person is not the same as confirmed loss. There is no solid ground to stand on. You do not know whether to hope or to grieve. You are suspended between two worlds. That suspension can last a long time, and it can change the way a family experiences every day. A ringing phone becomes heavy with possibility. A knock at the door becomes frightening. News reports become both comfort and torment, and the waiting becomes its own form of suffering. As these disappearances remained unresolved, law enforcement continued searching for leads. But without bodies, without clear crime scenes, and without direct evidence, investigations can struggle. A person can vanish into a vast country, and the absence itself becomes difficult to interpret. Was this voluntary travel, a decision to disappear, or was this something darker? It is often at this stage that investigators begin revisiting assumptions. They look for links they may have missed. They check whether names appear in multiple places. They compare reports. They examine whether the same kinds of sightings appeared in different cases. And in the story of the backpacker murders, that gradual recognition became the turning point. These were not isolated vanishings. These were not just separate tragedies. Something was connecting them, moving through the same landscape, leaving behind a trail that was not yet fully visible. The disappearances began quietly, as missing people often do, but the silence they created was not temporary. It was the beginning of a case that would eventually show Australia that something dangerous was hiding in the open road, and that the freedom of travel had, for some, been turned into an opportunity for harm. In the early phase of an investigation like this, the work often begins in a fragmented way. Separate police stations, separate missing person reports, separate families pushing for answers that are difficult to find. Before a case becomes a single major operation, it often exists as several smaller concerns, each one handled in its own local context. That is one of the reasons the early searches in the backpacker murder story were so difficult. The disappearances did not arrive all at once. They unfolded across different years and different routes. And because travel can naturally involve unpredictability, the first assumption was not always that a crime had occurred. When police receive a missing person report, the first step is usually to establish the baseline. Who is missing? When they were last seen? Where they were last known to be? What their plans were? Who they were traveling with? Whether there is a reason they might have changed course without notifying anyone. With backpackers, this can become complicated quickly. Travelers often move between hostels, campgrounds, and temporary stays. They meet people briefly and then separate. They may not keep strict schedules. They may hitchhike or accept rides, leaving fewer official records behind them. In the early 1990s, this lack of reliable tracking was even more pronounced. There were no smartphones, no live maps, no instant check-ins. If a person missed a phone call home, it did not always signal danger immediately. It could simply mean the person was busy, tired, or somewhere with limited access to phones. This uncertainty affected the early search process. Some missing person reports may not have been treated with the highest urgency at the beginning, not because police did not care, but because the information available did not always point clearly toward a crime. Investigators had to consider whether the person might turn up on their own. Meanwhile, families and friends often sensed something was wrong long before the system could confirm it. Loved ones notice patterns. They know how someone normally behaves. They know whether silence is typical or unusual. And when that silence continues, concern becomes sharper and more persistent. Early searchers likely focused first on what could be confirmed, checking hostels and accommodations, speaking with staff and travelers, looking for any record of the missing person's name, contacting transport services where possible, asking whether anyone remembered a particular pair of travelers, a particular accent, a particular plan. But in backpacker environments, details can disappear quickly. Hostile staff see hundreds of faces. Travelers arrive and leave within days. People forget names. Memories blur. A person who was present for one night can vanish from everyone's mind by the end of the week. Police may have also searched areas connected to the last known routes, roads where hitchhikers were seen, towns where travelers were last reported, places where someone might have stopped for a meal, a rest, or a ride. But the size of the landscape made this incredibly difficult. New South Wales alone is vast. There are forests, beaches, long stretches of highway, and remote bushland that can swallow sound and movement. Searching such a region is not like searching a small neighborhood. It is like searching an entire world made of distance. And when time passes, the search becomes harder. Witnesses forget. Physical traces fade. Possible evidence is washed away by weather or disturbed by wildlife. What might have been visible in the first days becomes invisible weeks later. Another major challenge in the early stage was the lack of confirmed connection between the missing persons. Each case could appear separate and without a clear pattern. Each one might be handled as an isolated disappearance. The human mind often looks for patterns quickly, but policing systems are cautious about assuming a pattern without evidence. Investigators must be careful not to merge cases prematurely, because doing so can create false links and distract from the truth. But there is also a cost to keeping cases separate for too long. If a pattern exists, failing to recognize it early can delay progress. It can allow an offender to continue. It can mean that vital information in one case is not shared or compared with another. This tension between caution and connection is part of what made the early years of this investigation so difficult. When people later look back on cases like this, they sometimes ask why the pattern was not obvious sooner. But the truth is that patterns are easier to see in hindsight, after the full story is known. At the time, police were dealing with scattered reports, incomplete information, and a type of missing person case that often resolves on its own. This is where missed connections can occur. Small clues that might have mattered were not yet understood as clues. A vehicle seen on the side of a road might have seemed ordinary. A stranger offering a ride might have seemed harmless. A conversation in a hostel might have been forgotten. Even witness sightings can be unreliable when people do not know a crime has happened. A person sees two travelers talking to someone, but the moment feels normal. It does not stay in memory as something important. Weeks later, when police ask questions, the witness may not remember what mattered. As time went on and more disappearances remained unresolved, the atmosphere began to change. Individual missing person reports started to feel heavier. The sense that these were not simply travelers moving on began to grow. Police began comparing information more carefully. They looked at common routes. They examined whether the missing persons had been in similar areas. They considered whether there was a possibility that more than one disappearance was connected to the same offender. This is often how major investigations expand. A few key investigators begin asking larger questions. They look for overlap. They exchange information between departments. They review older reports and wonder whether something was missed. And in this case, that process mattered deeply, because what had been seen as separate disappearances began to form a pattern that was too troubling to ignore. Another factor in the early years was the international nature of some of the victims. When travelers from overseas went missing, coordination between countries became part of the challenge. Families were far away. Communication was slower. Paperwork, record sharing, and cross-border cooperation took time. For families outside Australia, the uncertainty could be even more unbearable. They were not only missing their loved one, they were missing their ability to search. They were reliant on updates that arrived slowly, and on investigations happening in a place they could not easily reach. In the early searches, police also faced a painful reality. Without a clear crime scene, missing person investigations can feel like searching for a shadow. There may be no physical evidence to collect, no clear suspect to question, no confirmed direction, only a widening circle of possibility and the constant fear that time is passing. And time, in these cases, becomes one of the greatest obstacles of all. Because the longer a person remains missing, the harder it is to reconstruct the final hours. The harder it is to follow the trail. The harder it is to find the moment where everything changed. The early searches and missed connections in the backpacker murders story were not the result of one single failure. They were the result of complexity, distance, time, uncertainty, and the difficulty of recognizing a pattern while still living inside it. The road that looked like freedom also created silence, and that silence made it harder for the truth to reveal itself quickly. But as the investigation continued, and as more information came to light, those early fragments began to shift into something more connected. A clearer picture began to form, and the case moved from uncertainty toward the recognition that there was, in fact, a larger and darker pattern unfolding across New South Wales. As more time passed and more families remained without answers, investigators began to look at the disappearances in a different way. What had once felt like separate missing person reports started to create an uneasy sense of connection. The timelines did not overlap neatly, but the circumstances did. Young travelers, long-distance journeys, remote roads, a country vast enough to hide absence for far too long. This is often how patterns are recognized in real investigations. Not through one dramatic discovery, but through slow comparison. Small details that repeat. Similar travel routes. Similar last known sightings. Similar pieces of uncertainty that keep appearing in the same places. At first, a missing traveler can seem like a personal tragedy without wider meaning. But when another traveler disappears under similar conditions, and then another, the question changes. It becomes less about what happened to one person and more about whether something is happening repeatedly. Police began reviewing the known facts side by side. They looked at where each person had been last confirmed. They compared dates, locations, and travel intentions. They examined the ways people had been moving and the places they were most likely to have passed through. In New South Wales, there were certain stretches of road that were popular with backpackers, routes that connected the coastal areas with Sydney, or that led down toward Melbourne, or inland towards smaller towns. These highways were used by locals every day, but they were also used by travellers who did not have cars, who relied on buses when they could, and on lifts when they needed. It was in these shared corridors of travel that investigators began to suspect a pattern. Part of the difficulty was that not all disappearances were reported immediately. In some cases, the alarm was raised quickly. In others, it took time for someone to realize the silence was not normal. This delay can happen, especially when someone is traveling, because loved ones assume the person might be off schedule, out of reach, or simply enjoying the journey. But delays make patterns harder to see. They scatter the timeline. They blur the moment when police should begin comparing cases. Still, as the list of unresolved disappearances grew, the sense of coincidence became harder to accept. Another reason the pattern became clearer over time was the growing awareness within police work itself. Investigators are trained to look for links, but they also rely on systems and communication. When cases are handled by different departments in different areas, information sharing becomes critical. As more attention was placed on these disappearances, communication improved. Officers compared notes. They revisited older files. They questioned whether there had been sightings that were not taken seriously enough at the time. They began to examine whether there were shared circumstances that could point to a single offender. At this stage, even small similarities matter. The same kind of travel style, the same type of route, the same general age group, the same kind of vulnerability that comes with hitchhiking or relying on lifts. But a pattern in missing persons is still not proof of a serial crime. It is only a sign that the possibility must be taken seriously. The moment when a missing persons pattern becomes more than theory is usually when something concrete is found, something physical, something that cannot be explained by ordinary travel disruption. In this story, that shift came when the investigation moved from worry to confirmed horror. Police discoveries in the Belanglo State Forest would become central to the case. Belanglo is a large area of bushland in New South Wales, southwest of Sydney. Like many forests, it is not a single hidden pocket, but a wide stretch of trees and quiet. In the daytime, it can feel almost peaceful. In the wrong context, it can feel frightening, because it is so easy for a person to be unseen there. The discovery of remains in that forest began to connect what had been separate missing person cases. It turned absence into evidence. It gave investigators a geographical anchor point, and it made it impossible to believe that these were isolated incidents with unrelated explanations. Once remains were found in the same general area, investigators had a new framework for the case. They were no longer searching only for missing people. They were searching for a killer. Even with that realization, police still had a difficult task ahead. Linking cases is one thing. Proving that a single offender is responsible is another. Investigators needed to determine whether the remains were connected to the known missing persons. They needed forensic identification. They needed timelines. They needed to understand how the victims might have reached that location. This is one of the hardest parts of building a serial case. Even when the crimes are linked by location, investigators must still show the connections clearly. They must establish that the events occurred in a way that points toward the same responsible person, rather than separate offenders. In the backpacker murders investigation, police began to treat the case as a major coordinated effort. They gathered resources. They focused attention on highways, travel routes, and reports of hitchhikers. They reviewed witness statements with a new understanding, knowing now that the missing persons likely did not simply move on. They also began to consider offender behavior. A person who commits crimes like this may target vulnerable people. A person may offer help, then take advantage of trust. The offender may blend into normal life, appearing ordinary, polite, harmless, even helpful. This is what makes serial crimes so unsettling. They often rely on social assumptions. The assumption that a person offering help is kind. The assumption that the road is safe. The assumption that danger is obvious and loud. But danger can be quiet, and it can wear a normal face. As police continued to link cases, the public reaction shifted. Travel communities became fearful. Hitchhiking began to feel different. People warned each other more urgently. Friends told friends to stop accepting lifts. Families called their children more often. The open road, once imagined as freedom, became associated with risk. This shift in public mood is an important part of the story. It shows how crime can affect society beyond the immediate victims. It changes behavior. It changes fear levels. It changes the meaning of ordinary choices. Investigators also needed to identify how many victims were involved. The term backpacker murders became associated with a specific number of victims, but the investigation itself had to determine what could be confirmed. Police had to separate cases that truly belonged to this series from cases that were missing for other reasons. This is another difficult reality in major investigations. When a serial offender is discovered, people begin to wonder about every unsolved case, every missing person, every unexplained death. The offender becomes a possible answer for many mysteries. But police cannot work that way. They must be precise. They must connect cases with evidence. They must avoid expanding the narrative without proof. So the pattern was built carefully, through forensic identification, through physical discoveries, through confirmed links between missing persons and the forest. Once that pattern was accepted, the investigation could focus on finding a suspect. Investigators could now ask a new set of questions. Who had access to that area? Who knew it well? Who had the opportunity to pick up travelers? Who could move through those routes without suspicion? And once police began thinking in those terms, the case moved into a more focused and intense stage. They were no longer simply trying to find missing people. They were trying to find the person who made them vanish, a person who understood the geography, a person who understood the trust of travel culture, a person who knew how to disappear into ordinary life after doing something terrible. This was the point where the backpacker murders stopped being a collection of separate tragedies and became one of the most urgent serial investigations in Australian history. As investigators began to link the disappearances and focus their attention on the growing pattern, the case moved into a new and more urgent phase. This is the stage of an investigation where police are no longer only searching for missing people. They are searching for a person with habits, a person with movements, a person who exists somewhere in ordinary life while carrying something hidden beneath it. In a case as large and complex as the backpacker murders, a breakthrough does not usually arrive in one clean moment. It arrives in layers, as evidence begins to form a shape. A location becomes central. A method begins to repeat. Witness details that once seemed unimportant begin to matter, and gradually the investigation starts to narrow. One of the most significant breakthroughs in this case was the discovery of human remains in the Belanglo State Forest. This forest became a key location in the investigation, not because it was mysterious in itself, but because it offered something an offender might seek: distance, cover, silence, a space large enough that a person could be hidden from view. Belanglo is the kind of place where sound does not travel far. The trees absorb it, the landscape swallows it, and once you step off a main track, the world can feel completely removed from the busy life of cities. Once remains were located there and linked to missing persons, investigators had something that could anchor the case. They were no longer dealing only with absence. They were dealing with confirmed crime, and that confirmation allowed police to begin working the case in a different way. The search of the forest itself was extensive. It required careful and repeated work, because bushland is difficult to search quickly. The ground is uneven, visibility is limited, evidence can be scattered or concealed, and every area needs to be checked methodically. As more discoveries were made, police began to build stronger links between the victims and the location, and this helped them develop an offender profile based on what could be inferred, carefully, from the circumstances. The offender likely knew the area, not necessarily as a local resident, but as someone familiar enough to navigate it confidently. The offender likely had access to a vehicle, because transporting victims and moving through long travel corridors without attracting attention would be difficult without one. The offender likely had a way of approaching travelers that did not create immediate alarm. This is one of the hardest aspects of such crimes to accept. The offender often appears normal, helpful, ordinary, someone who offers assistance rather than threat. And in travel culture, where people rely on strangers for directions, company, or rides, that appearance can be enough to open a door. As investigators developed this understanding, they also began reviewing reports of backpackers and hitchhikers who remembered interactions that felt strange in hindsight. A car that slowed down, a driver who asked too many questions, someone who seemed overly interested in travelers, someone who offered a ride and then behaved in a way that made the passenger uneasy. In the early stage of a case, these experiences might be dismissed as discomfort. People do not always report them. They may simply move on, thankful nothing happened. But when a serial pattern becomes known, these memories can become crucial. Police also began paying attention to the broader geography of the crimes, the routes backpackers were taking, the places they were last seen, the towns and roads that seemed to appear again and again in witness reports. This kind of mapping can reveal patterns in offender behavior. An offender may choose areas where victims are easiest to find, places where hitchhikers wait, hostels where travelers gather, roads where rides are commonly offered. And if police can identify those areas, they can begin narrowing who had frequent access to them. Investigators in this case also focused on a practical question. How did the offender consistently gain control of victims? A person picking up travelers would need a certain kind of confidence. They would need to appear safe enough that someone would accept the ride. That suggests an offender who seemed stable and believable. Someone whose car looked normal. Someone who did not immediately raise fear. And this is where the case began shifting from a broad hunt to a more focused suspicion. As the investigation continued, police attention increasingly turned toward Ivan Milat. Milat was not initially a public name, but over time, police began to connect him to factors that made him stand out. Milat lived in the region of New South Wales, and he had familiarity with the areas involved. He had access to vehicles, he had the ability to move around without drawing attention, and he had a personal history that, when examined, raised serious concerns. In this stage of an investigation, police do not rely only on one suspicion. They build a case by collecting evidence that supports the suspicion from multiple directions. They look for corroboration. They look for forensic links. They look for possessions. They look for witness identification. They look for anything that moves the case from possibility toward proof. Search warrants become critical at this stage. Investigators may search homes, vehicles, and personal property. They are looking for items that could connect a suspect to victims, to locations, or to the crime itself. This is often the turning point where an investigation becomes significantly stronger or collapses, because searches either reveal something tangible or they do not. In the backpacker murders investigation, police searches of Ivan Milat's property produced evidence that investigators believed connected him to the crimes. This included items belonging to victims. These discoveries were important because they provided physical links rather than theory. Physical evidence has a different weight than narrative. It can be tested. It can be traced. It can be shown in court. And it can move a case from suspicion into formal prosecution. As these links became clearer, police were able to focus their attention more narrowly. They built a timeline of Milat's movements. They examined his access to the relevant roads and regions. They looked at witness accounts again, now with a suspect in mind. They revisited older details with new clarity. When a suspect emerges in a serial case, it can feel like the air changes. The investigation shifts from "who could this be" to "can we prove this is the person?" That shift is both hopeful and heavy. Hopeful because there is finally a direction. Heavy because the evidence must be strong enough to hold. For the families of the victims, this stage brings a complicated kind of emotion. There is relief that progress is being made, but there is also pain, because progress often confirms the worst fears. It means the missing persons were not simply lost or delayed. It means something happened that cannot be undone. The suspect emergence stage is also when the public response intensifies again. People want details. They want answers. They want to know how someone could do this and remain unnoticed for so long. They want to know whether anyone else was involved. They want to know how the victims were chosen. But an investigation must remain careful. It must avoid exaggeration. It must avoid assumptions. It must focus on what can be proven. At this stage, investigators believed they had the right person. Ivan Milat was arrested, and the case moved toward trial. That movement toward court was not the end of the story. but it marked the point where police were confident enough in the evidence to bring the case into the legal system. In calm reflection, this is the part of the story where certainty begins to emerge from confusion. Not total certainty, not peace, but a direction. A sense that the pattern had a source, a person behind it. A person who had moved through the same roads that travelers trusted. A person who had used the openness of travel against people who only wanted to see the world. And with that, the story entered its most formal stage. The courtroom, where evidence becomes argument, and where the question is no longer only what happened, but what can be proven beyond reasonable doubt. As the investigation narrowed and the case began to take a clearer shape, police attention focused more strongly on Ivan Milat. In many major investigations, this is the moment when everything becomes more intense. The work moves from broad searching to concentrated scrutiny. The question changes from whether a serial offender exists to whether the evidence can identify that offender with certainty. Ivan Milat was living in New South Wales, and investigators began to look closely at Milat's movements, history, and possible connections to the areas involved in the disappearances. This kind of scrutiny is rarely based on one single clue. It usually comes from a combination of factors, each one small on its own, but heavier when placed together. Police examined the geographic reality of the case. Belanglo State Forest had become central, the roads leading into it, the routes travelers used, the towns and highways that linked backpacker travel to the wider map of New South Wales. Investigators needed to understand who might be familiar enough with those places to move through them confidently. They also needed to understand what kind of person could commit crimes like this without attracting immediate attention. Someone with access to a vehicle, someone comfortable speaking to strangers, someone capable of appearing ordinary while carrying harmful intent. As Milat became a suspect, police began gathering evidence in a careful and structured way. Investigation is not only about suspicion, it is about proof. It is about building a case piece by piece, so that when the suspect is confronted, the case can stand up under the pressure of court. In a high-profile series like this, investigators would have compared the known timeline of disappearances with Milat's work and personal routines. They would have looked for overlap in time and location. They would have checked whether Milat had reasons to be near the travel corridors where backpackers were last seen. They would have looked for any known patterns in Milat's life that matched what the investigation suggested about the offender. A major part of this stage involves witness accounts. When police have a suspect, they return to old statements and look for details that might fit more clearly. A traveler who remembered a certain car, a person who remembered an interaction that felt uncomfortable. A description that was too vague before becomes more meaningful once investigators know what to compare it against. This does not mean every witness memory becomes reliable after the fact. In reality, memory remains fragile, but patterns can emerge. Multiple people can describe similar experiences. Multiple accounts can point toward the same type of person, the same type of approach, the same kind of behavior. Investigators also used search warrants during this stage. Search warrants are not issued casually. They require police to show that there are reasonable grounds to search a property, a vehicle, or possessions connected to a suspect. Once those warrants are issued, the search becomes one of the most critical moments in an investigation, because this is where evidence becomes tangible. Police searched for items that could connect Milat to victims. Personal property, clothing, identification, any object that should not have been in his possession. Investigators also searched for weapons, restraints, or tools that could connect him to the crime pattern. In this case, the police search produced evidence that investigators believed directly linked Milat to the victims. This was not simply speculation or theory. It was physical material, items that could be identified and traced back to people who had disappeared. These findings mattered because they changed the case's foundation. They created a direct connection between suspect and victim, which is often the strongest kind of evidence an investigation can hope for in a series like this. Once such evidence exists, the investigation moves toward arrest. Arrest is a procedural moment, but it is also a human moment. It is the point where police take the suspicion out of the realm of investigation and into the realm of law. It is the moment where a person's freedom is removed because the state believes there is enough evidence to charge them with serious crimes. In May 1994, Ivan Milat was arrested. This arrest was a major development in the case, and in Australia's national awareness, it signaled that police believed they had found the person responsible for multiple murders connected to the backpacker disappearances. For the public, the arrest was both relief and horror. Relief because the fear that had been growing around these disappearances finally had a focus. Horror because it meant that the crimes were real, confirmed, and connected, and that the missing were no longer simply missing. For the families of the victims, the arrest brought something even more complicated. It was not closure, not yet, but it was movement. It was the feeling that the long uncertainty might finally break open into truth, even if that truth would be painful to hear. The arrest also brought intense media coverage. The backpacker murders had already drawn public attention, but now there was a suspect in custody, and the media wanted details. They wanted background. They wanted explanation. They wanted to understand who Ivan Milat was and how this could have happened. Police, however, had to stay focused. An arrest is not a conviction. It is the beginning of a legal process. From this point, investigators must ensure evidence is handled correctly. They must prepare for court. They must ensure that every link in the chain of evidence is documented, because defense lawyers will challenge everything. This is the stage where investigations become even more careful, because mistakes can damage a prosecution. In high-stakes cases, everything is examined: how evidence was collected, how search warrants were obtained, how witness statements were handled, how suspects were interviewed. The evidence must not only exist, it must be legally valid and responsibly gathered. As Milat was held and charged, the case began moving toward trial. The public began to understand the scale of what police believed they had uncovered. The disappearances were no longer separate tragedies. They were part of a series, and the suspect was now named. But even with a suspect in custody, there were still questions. Questions about how many victims there were. Questions about whether the crimes were fully understood. Questions about whether Milat acted alone. Questions about whether other disappearances might be connected. Investigators had to remain disciplined. They could not expand the case without proof. They could not promise answers to every question. They could only follow what evidence could support. The investigation and arrest of Ivan Milat marked the moment when the backpacker murders moved into a more formal chapter. A chapter where evidence would be tested in court, where legal arguments would shape public understanding, and where the story would finally reach the point that families had been waiting for. Not peace, exactly, but accountability, and the closest thing the system can offer to justice after loss has already occurred. When the case against Ivan Milat moved into the courtroom, it entered the part of the story where investigation becomes formal proof. This is where police work, forensic evidence, witness statements, and recovered items are tested under the strict rules of law. A trial is not simply a retelling of events. It is an argument about what can be established beyond reasonable doubt. For the families of the victims, the trial would have carried a particular kind of emotional weight. It was the first time the disappearances, the waiting, and the uncertainty were being addressed publicly in a structured and official way. It was also the moment when the worst fears that had haunted them were no longer just possibilities. They were being spoken about in court as facts for the public. The trial was watched closely because this case had already changed the way Australians thought about travel and hitchhiking. The idea that young backpackers could disappear on the open road, and that the truth could remain hidden for years, created a lasting fear. A trial meant that the country might finally hear how investigators connected the dots and why they believed Milat was responsible. In court, the prosecution's task was to present a clear narrative supported by evidence. They needed to show that Milat was not merely suspicious, but guilty. They needed to connect him to victims, to locations, and to actions in a way that a jury could rely on. One of the strongest parts of the prosecution case involved physical evidence. During searches connected to the investigation, police recovered items that were identified as belonging to victims. In a serial case, this kind of evidence carries enormous weight. It is not a rumor, it is not a theory, it is something tangible, something that can be traced. When a victim's belongings are found in a suspect's possession, it creates a direct link that is difficult to explain away. The defense can attempt to argue innocent transfer or misunderstanding, but in cases involving multiple victims, that becomes harder to sustain. The prosecution could present these items as part of a wider pattern that pointed toward Milat as the person who obtained those belongings through criminal acts. The prosecution also relied on forensic and investigative links to Belanglo State Forest. The forest was central because it was where remains were found, and because it provided a geographic thread connecting multiple victims. The prosecution needed to show that this was not coincidence, that this location was tied to the offender's behavior, and that Milat had familiarity and access consistent with that behavior. Witness testimony played an important role as well. In the years leading up to Milat's arrest, travelers and others had described experiences that became more meaningful once police had a suspect. Some accounts involved rides offered, interactions that felt unsettling, or memories of a person who seemed too interested in travelers. In court, witness testimony is examined carefully. The prosecution may present it to establish opportunity and pattern, while the defense will challenge memory and reliability. Witnesses are asked to describe what they saw and when they saw it. They may be questioned about how well they remember, how much time has passed, and whether their recollection could be influenced by what they later heard in the media. The defense in the Milat trial worked to create reasonable doubt. In any criminal trial, the defense does not need to prove innocence beyond all doubt. The defense needs only to show that the prosecution's case is not strong enough to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. That difference matters. It means the defense will focus on weaknesses, gaps in timeline, ambiguities in evidence, alternative explanations, anything that could leave a jury uncertain. In cases built on patterns, the defense may argue that pattern recognition can create bias, that investigators, once convinced of a suspect, interpret evidence in a way that fits their conclusion. The defense may suggest that items found could have been placed there, or that they could have been obtained through unknown means, or that the connection is not as direct as the prosecution claims. But the prosecution in this case presented a story that combined physical evidence with investigative context. They argued that Milat had access to the victims and the locations. They argued that the presence of victim property linked him directly, and they argued that the crimes formed a pattern consistent with a single offender, rather than random, unrelated events. The trial also carried the weight of what had been found in the forest. The discovery of remains and the forensic identification work was not merely background detail. It was the confirmation that these disappearances were murders, that the missing were not simply lost travelers, they were victims of violence. Because this channel avoids graphic description, we speak about this gently. But it is important to acknowledge that in court, the reality of harm is presented more directly. Evidence is discussed with precision. The prosecution explains what was found and how it connects to the charges. This is difficult, but it is part of the legal process, because the jury must understand the seriousness of what is being alleged. As the trial unfolded, the jury heard the evidence and weighed it. They listened to expert testimony. They examined exhibits. They heard arguments about what each piece of evidence meant and what it did not mean. In the end, the trial reached its most important moment. The verdict. Ivan Milat was convicted in 1996 of 7 murders connected to the backpacker murders case. This conviction was a major legal conclusion, and it meant the court had accepted the prosecution's case beyond reasonable doubt. It meant the jury believed the evidence proved Milat's guilt. After the conviction, Milat was sentenced to life imprisonment, with terms that effectively ensured he would spend the rest of his life in custody. This sentencing reflected the severity of the crimes and the scale of harm. For the families of victims, the verdict may have brought some measure of justice, but justice is never the same as restoration. A conviction can confirm truth and hold someone accountable, but it cannot undo loss. It cannot return time. It cannot erase the years of waiting, uncertainty, and grief. For the public, the verdict changed the meaning of the case. It became a confirmed series with an identified offender. The fear that had lived in uncertainty now had a name and a face, and the idea of an unknown threat on the roads became, at least in part, resolved through legal accountability. But even with the conviction, questions did not fully disappear. Some wondered whether all victims connected to the case had been identified. Some wondered whether Milat acted entirely alone. Some questioned whether other disappearances in that era might be linked. In cases of serial crime, these questions are common because the full scale is difficult to measure. The legal system, however, focuses on what can be proven. The conviction established Milat as responsible for 7 murders, and the court outcome became the official conclusion of the case. That was the point where, in law, the country could say the backpacker murders had been solved in a formal sense. Yet the emotional truth was more complicated. A solved case can still leave an echo. It can still reshape society. It can still change how people think about travel, trust, and the open road. The trial, the evidence, and the verdict did not only identify an offender, they ended an era. They marked the moment when the innocence of certain travel assumptions was permanently altered. The road would never feel the same again, not for Australia, and not for the families who had waited so long for answers. And even now, decades later, the name of the case remains a reminder, not only of crime, but of vulnerability, of how quickly freedom can be turned against someone, and of the heavy cost that can be left behind when a stranger's smile hides something much darker. After the verdicts were delivered and Ivan Milat was convicted, the case moved into the sentencing phase. In many trials, sentencing is the moment where the courtroom shifts from proving what happened to deciding what the consequences will be. It is the legal system's attempt to respond to harm with a measured, formal outcome. In cases involving multiple murders, sentencing is not simply a number of years. It becomes a statement about severity. It becomes a clear message that the crimes were not only unlawful, but deeply damaging to society. And it becomes the point where the legal story reaches its final shape, even if the emotional story never fully ends. Ivan Milat was sentenced to life imprisonment. The court's sentencing reflected the seriousness of the crimes, and it ensured that Milat would remain in prison for the rest of his life. This was a decisive conclusion in legal terms, and for many people, it was the first moment where the case felt as though it had reached an ending that could not be undone. For the families of the victims, the sentencing would have been complex. Some families describe these moments as a form of relief because they finally see accountability. Others describe it as hollow because no sentence can replace what was taken. Often it is both at once, relief and grief, side by side. One of the hardest truths about sentencing is that it cannot give people their loved ones back. It cannot erase the years of uncertainty and waiting. It cannot restore the future that was supposed to happen. It only closes the legal question of who was responsible and what the consequences will be. And yet, sentencing matters. It matters because it acknowledges harm publicly. It matters because it affirms that the victims were wronged. It matters because it places responsibility where it belongs, on the offender, rather than leaving the story in the uncomfortable space of mystery. For Australia as a whole, the conviction and sentencing of Ivan Milat had a profound impact. The backpacker murders were not only a criminal case, they became a national memory. They touched on fear, on travel culture, on the open road identity that Australia is often associated with. Australia is a country where distance and travel are part of ordinary life. People drive long stretches to see family. People travel across states for work. Backpackers from around the world come to explore, drawn by the promise of adventure and wide open freedom. The case disrupted that image. It introduced a darker awareness. The idea that the road could hide danger, that remote bushland could conceal crime, and that trust, one of the foundations of travel culture, could be exploited. In the years following Milat's sentencing, hitchhiking began to change. It had already been declining in some places, but cases like this accelerated the shift. People became more cautious. Travelers relied more on formal transport. Hostels and travel communities began sharing safety advice more openly. Families back home asked for more frequent check-ins. Public fear in cases like this is not irrational. It is a response to the realization that ordinary freedom includes vulnerability. The idea of accepting a lift from a stranger, which once felt like a simple part of backpacking, became something many people began to see as too risky. The case also affected Australia's international reputation in a particular way. For travellers overseas, it raised questions about safety. Families in other countries heard about missing backpackers and became anxious about their children travelling. Australia remained a popular destination, but the case created an enduring association that some visitors could not ignore. For law enforcement, the national impact was also significant. The investigation became an example of the importance of linking cases, sharing information, and recognizing patterns in missing persons reports. It showed how scattered incidents, when viewed separately, can hide a larger threat. It also showed how remote geography can challenge disclosures, making it harder for crimes to be discovered quickly. The backpacker murders led to lasting changes in the way people thought about missing travelers. It reinforced the idea that missing persons cases should be treated seriously and connected thoughtfully, especially when similarities appear across different reports. It also created a kind of cultural memory around Belanglo State Forest, a place that, for many years, became associated not with nature, but with fear. Forests are often symbols of peace, quiet, and escape. But once a place becomes connected to a major crime, the symbolism changes. The same trees, the same roads, the same tracks can feel different, not because they have changed, but because the story attached to them changes the way people see them. The impact of this case can also be seen in the way Australia talks about backpackers and travellers. It became a reminder that travellers are not only visitors, they are people. People with families who love them. People with futures. People who deserve safety even when they are far from home. When the victims were young and international, the grief travelled across borders. It did not stay inside one country. The pain belonged to families on the other side of the world, and it created a shared sense of tragedy that extended beyond Australia's coastline. Another aspect of the national impact was the way this case shaped public perception of serial crime in Australia. Serial murder is not something most people expect to encounter. When it happens, it creates a collective discomfort. It challenges the idea that danger is rare. It forces the public to accept that a person can commit repeated harm over time while living within society. That realization can be frightening, but it can also lead to stronger awareness. It can encourage communities to take missing persons reports seriously. It can encourage travelers to share information quickly. It can encourage law enforcement to treat patterns with urgency. But even with this awareness, the case remained a heavy presence. It was not only the shock of what happened, it was also the lasting feeling that there were likely moments when the victims thought everything was normal, moments when they believed they were safe, moments when they expected the road to take them to the next stop, like it always did. That is why the case stays with people. It carries the quiet cruelty of normality turning into tragedy without warning. The sentencing of Ivan Milat provided legal resolution. The offender was identified. The court reached its conclusion. The state delivered punishment. But the case did not disappear into history, because its impact was not limited to a courtroom. It reached into the way people traveled, the way parents worried, the way backpackers planned routes, the way Australia thought about its own landscape and its own sense of safety. And for the families of the victims, the impact was permanent. Sentencing closed the legal process, but grief does not follow legal timelines. Grief has its own pace, its own rhythm, its own quiet persistence. In the end, the national impact of the backpacker murders was a shift in awareness, a change in the way freedom on the road was understood, a reminder that openness is beautiful, but it can also be used against the vulnerable, and that safety, in any country, is not something to assume without thought. It is something society has to protect, constantly, quietly, and with care. Even after the trial ended and Ivan Milat was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison, the story did not become completely still. In a legal sense, the case had a confirmed outcome. The offender had been convicted. The court had delivered its decision. The system had done what it could to hold someone accountable. But in a case of this scale, later developments continue to unfold. Not always because the core facts change, but because public interest remains, and because the questions that surround serial cases often do not disappear just because a sentence has been given. In the years that followed, Ivan Milat remained a figure of intense public attention in Australia. His imprisonment did not end interest in the crimes. Instead, it created a new phase, one where the nation watched to see whether he would ever provide further answers, and whether there were details still unknown. One of the continuing questions in this case was whether Milat acted alone. In many serial investigations, the public wonders if there were accomplices, not always because evidence suggests it clearly, but because the crimes feel too large for one person. People ask whether someone helped, whether someone knew, whether someone remained silent. In the backpacker murders case, the official convictions were connected to Ivan Milat, and the legal outcome treated him as the individual responsible for the murders he was charged with. There was no confirmed legal conclusion that another person was formally involved in those crimes. However, public speculation did continue. Some people believed it was difficult to imagine the crimes being carried out entirely alone. Others believed the evidence supported a single offender. These debates remained part of how the case was discussed in the years after the trial. It is important, especially in calm documentary storytelling, to keep the separation clear. What is confirmed is that Milat was convicted of 7 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. The broader question of whether there were any accomplices remained a subject of public discussion rather than a confirmed legal finding. Another question that continued to surface involved whether all possible victims had been identified. In serial cases, people often wonder if the confirmed list is complete. They look back at other disappearances, other unsolved cases, other missing travelers from the same period, and they ask whether those losses could be connected. Police and investigators generally approach this carefully, because connecting additional cases requires evidence, not suspicion. Yet the existence of such questions is understandable. The backpacker murders stretched over years, and the crimes occurred in a landscape that made discovery difficult. Because of that landscape, the possibility of unknown victims becomes part of the unease surrounding the case. Not proven, but difficult to dismiss fully in the public imagination. Over time, another development became part of the story in a different way. Ivan Milat maintained his innocence for many years and did not provide full admissions that would answer lingering questions. This is a reality in many major cases. Some offenders confess, some do not, some cooperate, some remain silent. When an offender refuses to provide information, families are left without details they may desperately want. Not details for curiosity, but details for closure. The kind of closure that comes from knowing what happened, when it happened, and why it happened. Without those admissions, parts of the case remain emotionally incomplete, even if legally settled. The public also watched Ivan Milat's behavior in prison, because in cases like this, people often search for signs of remorse or truth. They look for moments where the offender might reveal something new. But prison life is often closed to public view, and the information that emerges is usually limited. Another notable later development involved Milat's health in the years before his death. He remained in custody, and as he aged, the question of whether he would ever speak openly about the crimes became more pressing to some observers. But the case never gained the kind of final confessional clarity that some people hoped would arrive. Ivan Milat died in prison in 2019. His death was a significant moment, not because it changed the legal outcome, but because it closed the final possibility of direct answers from him. For some families and members of the public, his death carried a sense of finality. For others, it brought frustration, because it meant that if there were still questions, they might remain unanswered forever. When an offender dies without offering clarity, the story becomes quieter, but the absence of answers can feel sharper. The case becomes frozen, not in resolution, but in limitation. The truth may exist, but there is no longer an opportunity for it to be spoken. There were also developments connected to the Milat family, which became part of public discussion. Some of Milat's relatives were known to have had involvement in criminal activity, and over the years, media attention sometimes turned toward the family as a whole. In particular, public interest often focused on whether any family member might know more than they had ever admitted. However, these ideas and suspicions largely remained speculative. They were discussed, debated, and revisited, but speculation is not the same as proof. It is important to keep that line clear, especially in a case that carries so much weight and pain. The confirmed facts remain the foundation. The convictions, the evidence presented at trial, the sentencing, the imprisonment, the death in custody, those facts are stable. What remains unstable and unresolved are the questions that do not have confirmed answers, questions that often appear in serial cases, even when there has been a conviction. Were there other victims? Did anyone else help? Was everything that happened fully discovered? These questions do not necessarily mean the case is unsolved. They mean that the human need for completeness often extends beyond what the legal system can provide. The legal system can prove certain charges. It can convict. It can sentence. It can identify responsibility for specific crimes. But it cannot always reveal every hidden detail, especially when the offender chooses silence. There is also the quiet question of how long it took for the pattern to be recognized. In hindsight, people look back and wonder whether earlier connections could have been made sooner, whether lives could have been saved, whether the system could have moved faster. These questions are painful, and they are common in cases like this. But they exist within the reality that investigations are built on information, and information arrives unevenly. Police cannot act on patterns they have not yet seen. They cannot connect cases without evidence to connect them. And in a landscape like New South Wales, in an era before modern tracking and instant communication, the challenges were enormous. This chapter of later developments reminds us that a case can be resolved in court and still leave human uncertainty behind. The country may have a name for the offender, but families may still have questions they will carry for a lifetime. And yet, even in that uncertainty, there is something meaningful in acknowledging the victims clearly and respectfully, in remembering that they were travelers, people on a journey, with futures that mattered, in recognizing that their stories were not simply part of a headline, but part of real lives. The backpacker murders became part of Australian history because of its scale and shock. But its lasting meaning lies in something quieter. The way it changed the understanding of travel, the way it changed public awareness, the way it revealed how risk can hide within freedom, and the way, even after a conviction, the human heart still reaches for answers because it wants the story to feel complete. Tonight, as we near the end of this case, we do not need to force those answers into existence. We can acknowledge what is known, we can honor what was lost, and we can accept that some questions, even after justice is served, remain gently unanswered in the background of history. There is a certain quiet that settles after a case like this, even when the legal outcome is confirmed. The courtroom ends, the headlines fade, years pass, roads fill again with ordinary travelers, and yet the story remains, resting somewhere in the background of public memory. The backpacker murders are remembered not only because of what happened, but because of where it happened. This was not a case confined to one building, one neighborhood, or one private space hidden from view. It unfolded across highways and bushland, in the wide-open geography that people often associate with freedom. That contrast is part of what makes it so unsettling. We tend to think of danger as something that belongs to dark corners, or to places that already feel unsafe. But the open road does not feel like a dark corner. It feels like possibility. It feels like sunlight, movement, and the promise that the next stop will be better than the last. For many young travelers in the early 1990s, Australia represented that promise. It was a country that seemed built for adventure. You could cross long distances, meet strangers who quickly became friends, and feel as though you were collecting a life story with every day that passed. Travel creates that feeling easily, because it removes the weight of routine. It makes everything feel fresh. A simple meal can feel exciting when it is eaten in a new place. A conversation can feel meaningful when it happens with someone you might never see again. A road can feel like a pathway to a completely different version of yourself. But travel also asks for trust. You trust that the map will lead you correctly. You trust that the bus will arrive. You trust that the hostel is safe. You trust that most people are ordinary. You trust that if something goes wrong, someone will help. And most of the time, those assumptions are rewarded. Most people are decent. Most journeys end peacefully. Most roads carry nothing more dangerous than fatigue or bad weather. That is why cases like this stand out so sharply. They are not the common experience. They are the exception. And yet, the exception has the power to change the way we see everything. After the backpacker murders became known, the idea of hitchhiking changed. The idea of accepting a ride from a stranger began to feel heavier. Not because kindness disappeared from the world, but because the risk became more visible. The story showed what can happen when trust meets the wrong person. This does not mean the world should be lived in fear. Fear is not a good guide for living. It closes the heart. It narrows the mind. It turns every stranger into a threat, and that is not reality. But awareness is different from fear. Awareness is calm. It is steady. It is the quiet understanding that freedom has edges, and that certain choices deserve more caution than we might want to admit. Awareness does not steal the beauty of travel. It simply helps protect it. The victims in this case remind us of something important. They were not reckless people trying to invite danger. They were doing what young people have always done. They were exploring. They were moving through the world with curiosity. They were living the kind of life that is supposed to create joy, and the harm done to them was not the result of their dreams. It was the result of someone else's decision to violate trust. That distinction matters, because blame can creep into the way people talk about victims, especially in cases involving travel. But the truth is simple. A person should be able to move through the world without being hunted. A person should be able to accept kindness without fear. A person should be able to travel and return home safe. When that does not happen, the responsibility belongs fully to the offender. There is also something to reflect on about the landscape itself. Australia's vastness is part of its beauty, but it can also be part of its danger. Distance creates silence. Remote areas create invisibility. A large country can hide truth for longer than anyone wants to accept. In this case, time mattered. Searches were difficult. Links were slow to form, and families lived inside uncertainty while the world continued to move forward. One of the most painful parts of true crime is the way time continues. The sun still rises. People still go to work. Roads still fill with traffic. Meanwhile, somewhere in the background, a family is still waiting for answers, still replaying the last conversation, still holding on to the hope that life will return to the way it used to be. Even when answers arrive, grief remains. Justice can hold someone accountable, but it cannot rewrite the past. It cannot restore the days that were stolen. It cannot return the simple future that was supposed to happen. And yet, there is a quiet meaning in telling stories like this with care. It is not about entertainment. It is about remembrance. It is about speaking the victims' names with respect and acknowledging that their lives mattered. It is about refusing to let them become only statistics or headlines. As the night deepens around you, you do not have to carry the fear of this story. You do not have to imagine the roads or the forest or the long distances. You can simply hold the lesson gently, the way you might hold a candle in your mind. That trust is precious, that freedom is beautiful, that caution is wise, and that life, fragile as it is, deserves protection. The backpacker murders changed the way many people thought about travel in Australia, but it also left behind something softer than fear. It left behind a reminder to look out for one another, to pay attention when someone disappears, to take missing persons seriously, to believe families when they say something is wrong, to treat travelers as human beings who deserve care, even when they are far from home. And tonight, as we come closer to the end, the story can be allowed to rest. The roads are quiet in your mind now. The forest is distant. The world outside your room is calm. You are here, safe in the present moment. And the night is doing what it always does. It is pulling everything towards stillness. Now that this story has been told, it is okay to let it drift away from you. You do not need to hold every name, every date, or every detail in your mind. You do not need to carry the weight of the investigation or the unanswered questions into your sleep. This case had a confirmed ending in court, but it also carried a long trail of uncertainty and waiting. And even when justice is served, the human mind can still feel unsettled by the quiet truth underneath it all. That life can be fragile, that trust can be misused, that ordinary choices can sometimes lead into unexpected places. But tonight, you are not on the road. You are not out in the distance. You are here, in the safety of this moment. If you are lying down, let your body become heavier. Let the mattress hold you fully. Let your shoulders soften, your arms loosen, and your hands rest without tension. If your brow has been slightly tight, allow it to smooth out now, as if there is nothing left to solve and nothing left to do. Take a slow breath in, and let it out gently. Feel your breathing settle into its natural rhythm, not forced, not controlled, just quiet and steady, like waves moving in the dark. If thoughts come, let them come. If they drift away, let them drift away. You do not need to fight your mind. You only need to stop following it. Let each thought pass like a car on a faraway road, heard for a moment, then fading until there is only stillness again. The night has its own pace. It does not rush. It does not demand. It simply arrives and slowly pulls everything into calm. In the dark hours, even the loudest stories grow quieter. Even the most intense moments soften at the edges. And the mind, when it is given permission, begins to unclench. So allow yourself that permission now. You do not have to stay alert. You do not have to protect the world. You do not have to be ready for anything. All you have to do is rest. If you are listening with your eyes open, you can let them close whenever they want to. If you are already half asleep, you can let yourself sink deeper. And if you are still awake, that is okay too. Sleep is not something you force. It is something you allow. Let the sound of my voice become less important now. Let it become part of the room, like the soft hush of night air against a window, or the quiet settling of a house that has finally gone still. Somewhere outside, the world continues, but it does not need you right now. Your only job is to exist in the quiet, to breathe, to soften, to let go. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, and thank you for listening with respect and calm. If you return again, there will be more stories here, told gently, without music and without shock. For now, let the night hold you. Let your thoughts slow down, let your body rest, and let sleep arrive in its own peaceful way. Good night.